Welcome back, Night Dwellers, to another episode of Simple Dark Stories. I'm your host, Mothy. In tonight's tale, Camp Folkwood, we follow Annie, a young girl full of excitement as she arrives at summer camp, eager for new friends and adventures. However, beneath the camp's serene exterior lies something dark and malevolent. Strange occurrences begin to unravel Annie's sense of reality, starting with a hideous wooden gnome she unearths in the forest, an object that holds a sinister secret. Turn down the lights and join me for a chilling journey where innocence meets unspeakable horror and ancient evils awaken. Annie flung open the car door, her face beaming with excitement. She grabbed a large luggage bag as her mother waved from the front seat. "Have fun at summer camp, sweetie. See you in 3 weeks." Annie had been waiting weeks to attend this all-girls summer camp, and now she was finally here. She stood in wonderment at the lush trees that surrounded the camp. The forest seemed to whisper secrets to her as the breeze rustled through the leaves. Her dark hair fluttered and she smiled as a sense of freedom washed over her. As she soaked in her surroundings, she suddenly felt a hand on her shoulder. Startled, Annie turned around to see a young woman with a high ponytail smiling down at her. "You must be Annie. I'm Katrina, one of the counselors here at Camp Folkwood," the woman said warmly. "I'll show you to your cabin." Annie followed Katrina down a dirt path lined with cabins on either side. The trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining like a web, casting long shadows across the ground. The sunlight barely pierced through the dense canopy, and Annie couldn't help but feel as though the trees were watching her, observing her every move. When they reached cabin 3, Katrina opened the door, revealing a room with 2 bunk beds on either side. The top 2 bunks were already occupied, so Annie placed her luggage on the bottom bunk closest to the window. The air inside the cabin was thick, carrying the scent of wood and something slightly like wet dog, which Annie couldn't quite place. Before she had time to dwell on it, a short girl with blonde braids jumped down from the top bunk across from her. "I'm Goldie. Have you been here before?" the girl asked, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "It's my first time," Annie replied with a smile. "I've been coming here for the past 2 years. I'll show you the ropes," Goldie said, motioning for Annie to follow her. As they stepped outside, the sunlight seemed brighter, almost blinding compared to the cabin's dim interior. There's a sign-up list at the counselor's cabin for activities like painting, kickball, swimming, crafts, and frisbee golf. We need to get on the list before it fills up. The 2 girls ran towards the counselor's cabin, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. But as they approached, Annie felt a chill crawl up her spine. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their shadows growing longer, darker. She shook off the feeling, blaming it on first-aid jitters. The line for the sign-up sheets was longer than Annie had expected. When it was her turn, several of the sheets were already filled up. "Dang it, swimming's full. Guess I'll go for crafts," Goldie muttered, a hint of disappointment in her voice. She turned to Annie. "What are you going for?" "I think I'll go for painting and hiking," Annie replied. "I'll also do painting then. Goldie said, her spirits lifting as she wrote her name below Annie's. Let me show you around before dinner. Annie followed Goldie as she led her to the canteen and other buildings. The camp felt like a small village, nestled in the heart of the forest, but there was an eerie stillness about it, as though the woods were holding their breath. As the sun began to set, the entire camp gathered around a large bonfire, roasting hot dogs and laughing. The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing into the night sky. A camp counselor named Becca spoke into a megaphone. Attention everyone, it's time for traditional camp scary stories. If you'd like to join, please gather around me. Annie and Goldie quickly found a good spot near Becca. The fire's glow cast long, flickering shadows across the campers' faces, making them look older, more sinister. The woods around them seemed to grow darker, as if the night itself was pressing in, eager to hear the stories. They change them every year, Goldie whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. For the next hour, Becca told haunting tales of deadly creatures, vengeful spirits, and gruesome deaths. However, one story that lodged itself in Annie's mind was about a cannibalistic gnome that roamed the woods, hunting for food. Becca described the gnome in vivid detail, its small, twisted body, the ragged red hat it wore, and the way it relished the taste of human flesh. The gnome's eyes, Becca said, were like empty voids filled with nothing but hunger. That night, Annie's dreams were plagued by the image of the gnome. She saw it creeping through the woods, its knife glinting in the moonlight, and its eyes fixed on her. She tossed and turned, unable to escape the nightmare. When she awoke the next morning, the fear still clung to her like a shadow. Over the next few days, Annie tried to forget the story, throwing herself into camp activities. She and Goldie attended painting class with the other girls from their cabin. Although Annie wasn't artistic, she admired the other girls' creations: fluffy dogs, oceans, and vibrant flowers. Her own painting, however, was a misshapen bird perched on a branch and a rainbow with muddled colors. She hesitantly showed her work to Goldie, who burst into laughter. Annie's heart sank, but she forced herself to laugh along, even though the sound felt hollow. After class, as the afternoon heat reached its peak, Annie decided to take a walk under the shade of the trees. The gravel paths meandered through the camp, but Annie chose the furthest one, wanting to explore the more secluded parts of the forest. As she walked, the camp noises faded away, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. The path led her to a large boulder, bathed in sunlight, standing out starkly against the shadowy trees. Annie approached it, feeling an odd sense of unease. The forest around her grew unnaturally silent, as if it was holding its breath. Next to the boulder, something caught her eye, a small mound of dirt. Compelled by a strange force, Annie knelt down and began to dig. The soil was loose, almost as if it had been recently disturbed. Her fingers brushed up against something hard, and she unearthed a small wooden gnome with a faded red hat. The gnome was ugly, its face twisted into a sinister grin, and in place of its eyes were two empty holes. The wood was old and weathered, as though it had been buried for years. Yet, despite its hideous appearance, Annie couldn't bring herself to put it down. An overwhelming sense of dread filled her chest as she stared at the gnome. I wonder if Goldie knows anything about this, she muttered to herself before racing back to the cabin. As she flung open the cabin door, panting, she was met with silence. The cabin was empty. She placed the gnome next to her bed and laid down, intending to take a quick nap. But as soon as she closed her eyes, she was plunged into a nightmare filled with blood, laughter, and the twisted face of the gnome filled her mind. As the vision started to consume her, she was jolted awake by several shrieks. Her heart pounded as she struggled to shake off the remnants of the nightmare. Blinking away the blurriness, she saw Goldie and the other girls standing around her bed, their faces contorted into anger and fear. "What's your problem, you psycho?" one girl spat, her eyes brimming with tears. "I always knew you were a weirdo," another girl said, her voice trembling. Confused, Annie sat up. "What's going on?" She looked at Goldie, desperate for answers. Goldie's face was pale, her eyes wide with shock as she pointed to the corner of the room. Annie followed her gaze and saw the source of the girls' distress. Their paintings were destroyed, ripped, crumpled, and smeared with red paint. The vibrant colors had been replaced with a sickening crimson. Yet oddly, Annie's painting remained untouched, lying neatly beside the carnage. "Who did this?" Annie asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You did," one of the girls accused. "I bet you were jealous your paintings suck, so you destroyed ours." The other girls nodded in agreement, their eyes filled with accusation. Annie felt her chest tighten, her throat constricting as tears welled in her eyes. "Goldie, you know I'd never do something like this. It has to be someone else," Annie pleaded, her hands trembling. But Goldie took a step back, lowering her head. The betrayal cut deep, and Annie's heart ached as the girls turned their backs and left the cabin. How could they believe she'd do something so horrible? She collapsed onto the bed, tears streaming down her face. She picked up the gnome, her hands shaking. The red paint on the gnome's hands caught her eye. It was fresh and wet. "It can't be," she thought, staring at the gnome's twisted grin. How could the gnome have done it? She needed to prove her innocence, but how? That concludes today's episode. Join us again next week for another spine-tingling tale on Simple Dark Stories. If you enjoyed this and would like to help out, please give us 5 stars and tell us what haunts your dreams. Until next time.